Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. They tell us about their passion, inspiration, and aspiration. And one of my favorite part of this podcast is the focus on their personal trajectories. I always learn a lot and I find it very interesting. It's October 25, 2019, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today, I'm exchanging with Dr. Paula Gant. Paula is responsible for identifying technology, market, and policy trends impacting the pace of energy systems transition and leading GTI efforts to develop and commercialize technology and scientific discoveries needed for natural gas and new energy system in the transition to a clean, efficient economy. Previously, she was working at the US Department of Energy and at the American Gas Association. And she was also a policy and government affairs specialist for Duke Energy Corporation. Hi, Paula.
Good afternoon, Leslie. It's great to hear your voice.
Thank you, and same here. And on the side note, I wanted to tell the world how excited I am to have you as a guest because you're a wonderful woman in energy. Great to know because you're brilliant, but also because you're a wonderful human being. And I want to stress this out. To paraphrase Madeleine Albright, there is a special place for women who support each other, and Paula is one of them. So thank you.
Oh, I love that. That's a high compliment. I really appreciate that, and it's very, very nice to be thought of in that way. So thank you.
Yes. So we're going to discuss many different things, but especially the long-term future for natural gas in the world of decarbonization. You've been thinking about natural gas, but with a long-term view, post-2030. And also different innovations and technologies. And I would like to first ask you, what is your vision, like in the next 10, 20 years for natural gas? Are we going still to call this molecule gas, by the way?
Right. So I think that natural gas use is going to continue to grow globally for the next several decades. And I think that demand is going to be very durable through mid-century globally. And that's natural gas as well as natural gas liquids. Because I think just as a practical matter, they're great energy carriers. They're very clean when we combust them, but also increasingly we're sorting out how we can not combust them and turn them into really useful things. And I think that demand is going to be very durable well through mid-century.
Mm-hmm. And well, that's great news for me. I'm not going to become right away an historian of natural gas. And so you've been thinking about many solutions for the future of our energy system, energy transition. Can you tell us a little bit, like, what's your current thinking about how to integrate new technologies and innovation in our energy mix?
Absolutely. This idea that energy systems are set to go through massive transitions is something that has me very interested. And also, I think it's interesting that sometimes people are framing this as a new challenge, as if our energy systems haven't just gone through a massive transition. And so I like to sort of put it in perspective of the transition we've gone through here in the US and in many ways globally over the past decade in moving from a perspective of energy scarcity to one of energy abundance, whether that's with natural gas supplies, oil supplies, renewables, or energy efficiency. And that's really created a sea change in our thinking about how energy relates to our national security, our economic security, our environmental security, certainly here in the United States and increasingly around the globe. And so that's a massive transition we've already been through. And now we're set up for the next decade and the next transition, which I believe will be characterized by efforts around decarbonization of our economy. And that's in addition to where we've already reduced CO2 from our energy systems. For example, abundant natural gas supplies have helped us reduce U.S. emissions from power generation, revitalize U.S. manufacturing, shifted how we think about geopolitics and energy. So we're going to carry that through in thinking across our economy beyond buildings and light duty transport, and how we're going to decarbonize our economy overall, which involves us thinking about industrial manufacturing uses. And I believe that, like the last transition we've been through, this transition is going to be led by technological innovation and economic drivers that are often, and when always, I think, as an economist, more powerful than government policy. And in fact, I believe that technology and economics leads policy instead of the other way around. So I'm very interested in what technological innovations are going to take us through this transition. And I'm particularly focused on what I see as dual imperatives for this transition in energy systems. That we need to be focused on leveraging low carbon gases and fuels in this transition, and that we need to be focused on making these transitions in a low cost manner.
Mm-hmm. So before going into those two points, can you illustrate a little bit the kind of innovations you're thinking about? And, we're still at an early stage, and some of them probably will be in use, while some of them will never make it to the big market. How do you pick? Do you pick winners? What's the strategy to know which technology we should bet on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that we're going to need a lot of innovation across a lot of different types of energy fuels, technologies, and delivery mechanisms. I don't think that we're anywhere near having the luxury of picking winners and losers at this point in time, or even the market being able to do that. I'm particularly interested in how our use of gas molecules is going to change over time, and the infrastructure that we're going to use to move those where we need them. So, by gas molecules, now we rely heavily on methane, for example. Increasingly in the United States, we're seeing efforts to grow supplies of renewable natural gas, so biomethane that's pipeline quality. We're also seeing increased focus on the long-term role that hydrogen can play. So efforts to understand the impact of putting hydrogen-rich gas into our infrastructure and using it in our equipment, and ultimately moving to hydrogen is an example of a pathway to low-carbon gases. And then in parallel to that, we're going to be taking methane, biomethane, hydrogen, and turning it into chemicals and materials as well.
So, yeah, I mean, the good thing with that is that we repurpose the existing pipeline infrastructure and storage tanks, so it's not becoming stranded and investments that are not being for use anymore. But are we going to use it for existing utilization or new utilization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's exactly the exciting thing to think about when we think about this transition of gas molecules, is that we can think about using existing infrastructure in ways that makes this transition economic. So our natural gas pipeline system that we have today in this country is incredibly pervasive, over 2.5 million miles of pipe, and highly deliverable with a lot of storage options along it. And so the question is, a question is, what would be the impacts of moving hydrogen-rich gas or hydrogen through that infrastructure on the infrastructure itself, and what accommodations might we need to make, as well as your question of, do we need to adapt equipment, for end use, whether it's in light or heavy industry, to accommodate those different types of gases. And some of those questions we know the answers to, and some we don't.
So we use a lot of gas for power generation, but also for industrial use, as a chemical feedstock and others. So you see the same applications also potentially for hydrogen.
Right. Or thinking about taking methane and decarbonizing it to make hydrogen with no CO2 emissions using methane cracking for example, today. Or taking methane and using novel processes like one we've developed at GTI called Cool GTL to make liquid fuels and chemicals using catalysts and other processes to do that with a much lower carbon footprint.
So is there other like one definition of renewable natural gas? Can you walk through?
Oh,
So
yeah.
what are the existing options right now?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, biomethane is methane produced from bio waste, whether that's landfill, agricultural waste, um, uh, water treatment, or timber waste. What the significance of renewable natural gas is that it has been upgraded to make it sure that it's pipeline quality, that you could put it onto the interstate pipeline system and meet the gas quality specs,
Yeah.
such that customers would know they could burn it in their equipment. And in their equipment,
Yeah.
to your earlier question.
And in Europe, it seems that they are a little bit more advanced in using it, but it's still a very tiny part of the market.
Right. Yeah. There's lots of opportunity to grow the supplies both here and in Europe, and certainly in the non-OECD world of this renewable resource.
What about the use of natural gas in plastic? Is it something we can also decarbonize?
Absolutely. And there's lots of innovation going on in thinking about next generation catalysis and other processes that will increasingly allow us to turn methane into plastics and chemicals, glass, and other things without combustion, and ultimately using CO2 in the process. So we are ultimately, the goal is that you are developing products that allow you to sequester CO2 in them long term. So, for example, you might be working on a next generation catalysis process for turning methane into carbon black that was emissions free, using methane and CO2 um, to produce carbon black emissions free. Maybe that CO2 you captured from industrial processes or from the atmosphere. And then out of that, you get a carbon black product that you might use for, say, structural building materials, so that we could actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere, combine it with an abundant source of methane, and sequester it long term into the next inventory of building stock that we're going to build in this country and around the world. And that's super exciting.
Yeah, very interesting. And so, in your vision of the use of a renewable gas and decarbonized energy system, do you still see some infrastructure that will be stranded or no?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think that's an open one, but one that's worth asking and then and I would say trying to avoid. Imperative in our transition to cleaner energy systems is to remember what we're solving for, and that there's really sort of a dual imperative here. One, we want to reduce emissions from the atmosphere so we can avoid a climate crisis, but we need to do that in ways that protect local communities from economic crisis, right? In other words, remembering overall, we're solving for human progress here, right? A planet with with no one that can afford to live on it is no good either, right? And that's why infrastructure, examining existing infrastructure is really important, particularly when we're comparing it against new systems that we haven't even built yet. Yeah, if we were starting from scratch, we might design everything differently, but we're not. We've made massive investments in existing, for example, pipeline infrastructure. And it's important that we ask questions about how we can transition that infrastructure well into the future. Because frankly, if we don't, the communities there that would get stuck with the cost of those stranded assets are the least able to bear it. And like a
Yeah,
smart
but
way to
yeah,
advance human progress.
what do you think investors listening to you are thinking? Should they build more pipelines or stop building pipelines?
So, pipelines are an incredibly efficient way to move energy around, right? We don't yet have a more efficient way to move and store energy. And particularly if you have a view, as many do that are thinking long term about energy, that around 2040, 2050, pick your year, hydrogen is going to emerge as an energy carrier in our energy systems. Then you're going to need to think about how you're going to move that hydrogen efficiently. And it seems like pipelines are going to be useful. So I'd bet on being interested in pipelines for a while.
Some of them are increasingly hard to get built in some of the US states. So that's something to watch for the future of the energy mix in those states
Absolutely. And I think that's a bit mired down in the short term, right? And people not understanding the long term role that infrastructure can serve for example, addressing interseasonal storage for renewables. We have the challenge of moving and where areas have peak production of renewables in the summer and a need to store those renewable electrons for winter uses. We don't have good options for doing that, particularly at scale post 2030. And no one expects batteries to perform that role. So one needs to be thinking about different options. Natural gas systems currently provide an option as we think about them transitioning to hydrogen. And we think about processes that would turn those renewable electrons into hydrogen that you then store on this natural gas system to deliver in a different season to provide interseasonal storage, which is what those pipes do now.
So talking about understanding those complex energy systems, it's a hard task for policymakers to navigate between all the different understanding of where we're going next with energy transition, decarbonization, and what's the role of different fuels. Do you have any recommendation on how they should approach this complex task of guiding us through that?
Yeah, I think that these are very interesting and disruptive times. I think following technological innovation with a broad view of there's no way to anticipate which innovation is going to happen, in which stream that we're investing in a particular time period. So sort of have a wide field of vision, but kind of get comfortable with we're not going to be able to predict the pace of innovation. But we can accelerate that pace by investing in continuing to invest in early stage R&D and really doubling down on our investments of demonstrating technologies that are ready for commercialization. I think that's a really important policy imperative right now for the U.S. in particular.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, being open-minded and patient will pay. And so that's a great transition, Paula, for our next segment, which is your professional trajectory. Because you had some time in government, you had some experience also in the private sector. Can you tell us a little bit about how you now, with some distance, how do you think your trajectory so far has been? Was it a linear path? Did you have roadblock on the way? Tell us a little bit about your experience so far.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is it didn't go according to plan because there wasn't really a plan, it turns out. It was definitely nonlinear. I've had roles in academia, in the private sector, in government, trade association, and now a nonprofit research and development organization in the energy space. And everything about it was nonlinear. Everything about it has has provided me opportunities to grow and stretch as a professional and as a person.
So it seems you've been very open-minded to new opportunities and get outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, and I don't know that I ever thought about it as getting outside of my comfort zone, but I'm really curious. I'm really curious about how the world works and how people organize themselves around new challenges and opportunities. So I tried to be open and raise my hand to step up to take on new projects, ask people how things worked, and and I guess as you say that about out of my comfort zone, it wasn't so much that as I fundamentally believe we learn by doing. And if I'm not doing
Hmm.
something, I'm not really learning. And I can't really read about it in
Yeah.
a book. I've just got to go try it. And sometimes I fail. And sometimes I fall flat
Hmm.
on my face in public, and that's just kind of part of doing something.
Yeah, but I like the principle of keeping moving, right?
Yeah.
And in terms of your personal trajectory, can you tell us a little bit about your work-life balance? You took a little break after your experience in the government. How did that contribute to your success now? And is it something you recommend?
Yeah. So, wow, my experience working at DOE and the Obama administration was just amazing. I mean, what a dynamic um, organization, so many important issues for the country and working on issues around the globe. And I really treasured that experience and learned so much, stretched, hour by hour every day. And it did lead me to need to take a break, right? Um, it was leaning in every
Yeah,
day, all the time, moving at speed. So I think, people talk about personal life, professional life, and striking a balance. And I just don't think that's a real thing. Um, as an economist, I understand the concept of equilibrium as a concept, but not a place that you arrive at, right? It's sort of an abstraction. And I kind of think that about this work life balance idea. I think about it more as there are intervals of time, and in those periods of
hmm,
time, we're trying to figure out what we are prioritizing and how to manage those priorities. And those change in different periods of our life, or even over the course of a year, maybe. Like
hmm,
we all know, maybe we're working towards a
hmm,
deadline and we've got to focus on it. But we have to remember to reset and come back to the other priorities too. And so, as you
yeah,
noted, I took some time off after my time in the administration, and I spent time focusing on my preteen son, walks in the woods with my
yeah,
friends, spending time with my family, focusing on my health, and then,
yeah.
now focusing back on energy transitions.
Yeah, and I think it's very good, for other professionals to understand that, you can push the pause button sometimes. You can give yourself some leverage in deciding the path of how you want to advance. There is actually I've listened a couple of episodes of this podcast, the Thrive Global podcast from Ariana Huffington, and she really advocates taking a pause sometimes, focusing on your sleep, because sometimes you forget that it's important to sleep. And I think it's important, to publicly acknowledge that we're human beings who have also mental health and need to rest
Absolutely.
sometimes.
I am a huge advocate for sleep. And I agree there are times when we forget that. Early in my time off, I did a lot of that sleeping stuff. Um, but we do need, I mean, cognitively, we need time for rest. We need rest and recovery so that we can be creative. Really
Yeah,
important that we give ourselves that time. And I think it's more more possible now than it has been, because we have our careers are much more flexible and adaptable. Now that doesn't mean that every opportunity is available to us at all times, like when we choose to step away or step back up. But I think that's why
hmm,
it's important to remember that we're managing multiple priorities, and our career is not the only one.
absolutely. Well, on this wise note, Paula, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure exchanging, and we'll have you back soon, and maybe we'll have one technology or one innovation that we'll discuss further, because It's a potential
Fantastic.
winner.
I always enjoy visiting with you, Leslie, and thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Right.
Here.
Have a good weekend. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on October 25, 2019. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.